There is a category of art that does not ask to be admired. It does not invite analysis, does not reward formal examination, does not open itself to the kind of considered aesthetic response that museums are designed to produce. It simply stops you before you have formed an opinion, before you have identified the technique or the period or the school, before your critical faculties have had a chance to organize themselves into something useful. It has already done what it came to do. In 1793, a sculptor named Thomas Banks finished a small marble figure of a sleeping child. The child's name was Penelope Boothby. She had died the previous year at the age of 5. When the figure was exhibited at the Royal Academy in London, King George III stood in front of it and wept. The Queen wept. Visitors to the exhibition wept. The response was so consistent and so overwhelming that it became, in itself, a kind of historical event. The moment a marble child stopped an entire country. No one has fully explained why. Penelope Boothby was born in 1785, the only child of Sir Brooke Boothby and his wife Susanna. Sir Brooke was a baronet, a minor aristocrat, a man of literary and philosophical interests who had been part of the intellectual circle around Erasmus Darwin and who had translated works of Rousseau into English. He was, by the accounts of those who knew him, a man of considerable feeling, someone for whom ideas and emotions were not separate categories, but different expressions of the same thing. Penelope died in March 1791, just before her 6th birthday. The cause is recorded as a fever. She had been, by the testimony of everyone who wrote about her, an unusually vivid child, the kind of child whose presence filled a room and whose absence emptied it. Sir Brooke Boothby commissioned Thomas Banks to make a memorial. Banks was the most respected sculptor in England at the time, the first English sculptor to have trained in Rome and brought back to Britain a direct engagement with the classical tradition and with the emerging aesthetic of neoclassicism. He had made funerary monuments before. He had made sleeping figures before. He had never made anything like this. The figure lies on a simple marble base, slightly smaller than life-size, dressed in the clothing she apparently wore in life. Not the idealized drapery of classical memorial sculpture, but a specific dress, with specific folds, that reads as a real garment rather than a sculptural convention. Her head rests on a small pillow. Her hands are folded. Her eyes are closed. She looks asleep, not dead. Asleep. This distinction is the technical achievement at the center of the work, and it is more difficult than it sounds. The difference between a sleeping figure and a dead figure in sculpture is not a matter of pose. Both are horizontal, both are still. It is a matter of tension. A sleeping body retains a slight muscular engagement, a readiness that the body in death has released entirely. The muscles around the eyes, the set of the jaw, the position of the hands. In sleep, these carry a faint charge of the life that is temporarily suspended. In death, they do not. Banks carved a body in which that charge is present. The face of Penelope Boothby does not carry the stillness of death. It carries the stillness of someone who is between one breath and the next, who will wake if you speak too loudly, who is temporarily absent rather than permanently gone. How Banks achieved this, how he found, in marble, the precise degree of tension that distinguishes sleep from death, is not something he documented. He left no account of the technical decisions that produced the effect. He simply produced it, and the people who stood in front of it in 1793 responded to it as if it were real. But this is where the story becomes stranger. The response at the Royal Academy was not simply emotional. It was culturally specific. The late 18th century in England was a period of enormous change in how childhood was understood. The influence of Rousseau, whom Sir Brooke Boothby had translated, had introduced into educated circles the idea that children were beings in a distinct condition of innocence and natural virtue, whose deaths were losses of a particular and irreplaceable kind. Before this shift, the death of a child had conventional responses, theological, ritualistic, formal. After it, the death of a child became a specific wound that could not be assimilated into conventional frameworks of grief. The Penelope Boothby Memorial arrived at exactly the moment when the culture was developing the emotional vocabulary to respond to it. King George III weeping was not simply a personal response. It was a cultural event, a public figure enacting, in public, the kind of grief that had only recently become possible to acknowledge. At first, this seems to explain the response. It doesn't, because the cultural context accounts for the readiness of the audience, not for the specific quality of the object that produced the response. Other sculptors made memorial figures of children in the same period. Other sculptors worked in the neoclassical tradition, trained in Rome, engaged with the aesthetic framework that Banks brought back to England. None of them produced anything that stopped King George III in his tracks. What Banks did that no one else did, and what he never repeated with quite the same force in any subsequent work, is more difficult to locate than a cultural explanation allows. It has to do with the specificity of the figure. The dress is specific. The pillow is specific. The position of the hands is specific in the way that the hands of a particular child in a particular moment are specific, not in the way that hands in memorial sculpture are generally positioned. Banks appears to have worked from observation, from memory, from descriptions provided by the family, possibly from studies made before or immediately after the child's death. The figure does not read as a generic sleeping child. It reads as this child in this specific condition of rest at this specific moment. Whether Banks understood that this specificity was the source of the figure's power is not something the record reveals. What the record reveals is that Sir Brooke Boothby, who sat with the grief of Penelope's death for the rest of his life, who never fully recovered from it, who eventually separated from his wife and died in France in obscurity, considered the Banks Memorial to be the most accurate representation of his daughter that existed, more accurate than memory, more accurate than the portrait paintings that had been made of her while she lived. The memorial is now in the parish church of St. Oswald in Ashbourne, Derbyshire, where it has been since 1793. It is not in a major museum. It is not on a prominent tourist route. It sits in a small English church, in a part of England that most visitors to the country never reach. And the people who make the journey to see it tend to describe the experience in terms that sound less like art criticism and more like something they are not sure how to classify. They say it is impossible to stand in front of it without feeling. Something happened, not something they chose to feel, not something they prepared for, but something that arrived before they were ready for it, and that stayed with them afterward in ways they did not expect. Thomas Banks died in 1805. He left behind a career of significant but uneven work, pieces that are accomplished, admired, placed correctly within the neoclassical tradition in its English variant. The Penelope Boothby Memorial sits outside this body of work, the way the Naumburg figures sit outside the medieval tradition around them. It operates by different rules. It achieves something the surrounding work does not approach. And Banks left no account of how he found those rules or what he understood about this specific child that allowed him to put her in marble in a way that made her more present than the living. She has been sleeping in that church for over 200 years. The dress has not changed. The hands have not moved. The pillow is still under her head, and the question of why standing in front of a marble child makes something happen in the chest of every person who has ever stood there, regardless of whether they knew her, regardless of whether they believe anything about what happens after death, regardless of whether they came prepared to feel something or came simply to look, is the same question it was in 1793, when King George III stood in front of it and found, to his apparent surprise, that he was weeping. He was not alone. He has never been alone in that response. No one has explained why.